Okay, the theme of the next group of books is religion and spirituality. And in some ways, it's very much tied to the parenthood thing because, um, especially while my partner was pregnant, I started doing a lot of introspection and research. I think partly because I was trying to figure out who I am and who I want, the baby to, how do I want the baby to know me, and so I started researching a lot of like religion and spirituality topics, but also a lot of genealogy and family history, which they're related. And we're going to talk about the other one a little bit later. But it kind of sent me down this path, which I've already, been studying world religions and philosophy and stuff like that for a long time. But it just had like a lot more meaning with, the parenthood thing about to happen. So I think one of the first ones that I read was this book called The Hussite King. It's by Otakar Odložilík. And this is about this guy named, what is his name? I forget his name. I read it a long time ago. George of Podbrady, yeah. And he was a king of Bohemia in the late 15th century, and he was a Hussite. So the reason that I read this book is because when I was growing up, the first church that I went to was a Moravian church, and usually nobody knows what that is, except for maybe some Methodists, because John Wesley writes about the Moravians he encountered on boats back and forth in between Britain and the New World in quotes. But basically, they were unless you count the other heresies in the Orthodox Church, Moravians, we consider ourselves, or they consider themselves, the first Protestant denomination, founded by the followers of John Huss, like almost 100 years before Luther nailed his theses to the door of the cathedral. So I was interested in studying Moravian religion, Hussitism, they called it back then. And I've also collected a lot of other books about the Moravian Church, but this is the one I chose to read. And this takes place, in the generation or two after John Huss, once the Hussites had enough political power to really, basically take power in Bohemia. And it was a difficult read, mostly because I don't have a strong background in Central Europe, in, the affairs, political affairs, religious affairs of Central Europe, besides, like the basic story of John Huss. And also no background whatsoever in the Czech language, and all these names, most of the names are in Czech, and a lot of place names and stuff like that. So that made it difficult and a little bit hard to follow at times. But it was very enlightening as far as, the Holy Roman Empire and how it was working at that time, because George, Bohemia was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and they were one of the electors. But everybody else was basically German speaking. Not everybody, but most of the other, polities that made up the Holy Roman Empire. The religious tensions were very real. It got violent at times. The author definitely has his sympathies. He's definitely sympathetic to the Hussite cause and to George of Podbrady. But, I think that, if anything, that helps add to the flavor. It helps you understand a little bit deeper who these Hussites were. And it was also interesting because, one of the things that I was studying in religion and spirituality, basically the two things I was studying besides this branch of Christianity, was our astrology and the tarot. And in the tarot, one of the suits is cups, which is, symbolic. The element is water. I was born in the sign of Cancer. My rising sign is also Cancer, so that's a lot of water. Uh, and why was this cup so important to these people at this time? You know, for them, it was an issue of you know, like of being true to your religion, of being true to the Bible, which was what they were really taking stock in, and Jesus. And if Jesus said, "Take this cup and drink," then they thought that was a big deal. You're supposed to do that. And the Roman Church at that time was saying, "No, you don't need to drink the wine. You just need to eat the bread. The priest can drink the wine." And so they had a really, really big issue with that. And I'm like, wow, you know, this is the church, the first church that I went into, and I'm here studying my own self, my chart, and you know, what do these elements mean for me and my life. And so I saw a confluence there between basically the Moravians and their importance of the chalice, and all this water. And all what it meant for me, you know, kind of spiritually. So yeah, it was interesting, very interesting, very deep dive into what was going on, you know, in Central Europe, Bohemia at that time. I also found out that some of my German ancestors might have actually been from Lusatia, which was part of Bohemia at that time. Now I think it's in Poland, but so yeah, this is one of the places where this study of religion and spirituality really intersect with my study of my own roots and of genealogy. The Hussite King by Bohemia in European Affairs, 1440 to 1471, by Otakar Odložilík. Okay, so that's the Hussite King. The rest of them are mostly about astrology. The first book I read about astrology was Chani Nicholas's "You Were Born for This." This is really, really good book for beginners. She went to Kepler in NorCal, and she's very attuned to the social movements. It's written as a manual, really. It's not really like a book to read, even though I read it straight through. But for beginners, I think it gives a very good overview of your three basic elements of your chart, which is your rising sign, your sun sign, and your moon sign. And it's very practical, very hands-on. This is a good one for beginners. You Were Born for This, Astrology for Radical Self-Acceptance by Chani Nicholas. And then the other writer I've been reading a lot of is Manly Hall, and mostly it's because he's here in LA, or he was, and it also ties into my genealogical research because my great-great-grandmother was an astrologer in LA in the 40s, maybe as early as the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so, you know, that's part of my family heritage. And I think she studied with Manly Hall at some point because she was in different parts of LA. But so I read this one, Astrological Keywords, compiled from leading authorities. Pluto in Libra, an interpretation. And when I was born, Pluto was in Libra. And I also have Saturn and Jupiter conjunct in Libra at that same time, around the time I was born. So this one was an interesting read for me also. And then the Star Lore of Babylon, which is about basically astrology, you know, in Mesopotamia. And I like Manly Hall's approach to astrology. It just is very, very old school, and he explains some things that nowadays people kind of take for granted and don't really explain. Writers like Chani Nicholas don't explain. And so I like having that background from somebody from back in like the 30s and 40s, or this one was written in the 70s, but his reading is very, very ancient. He read a lot of the Neoplatonists and a lot of the classical writers about astrology. So it really kind of undergirds his perspective. Okay, and then a few more. So then I also read Initiated, which is by Amanda Yates Garcia, and she is also known as the Oracle of Los Angeles. And this is a really recent book. I think it came out, let's see, it came out in 2015, no, sorry, 2019. Yeah, 2019. So this one just came out 2 years ago when I read it. And it's about basically witchcraft. And it's a memoir, her experiences growing up, going to Europe and coming back, and connecting with her roots, because her mom was part of this witchcraft tradition by this guy, what's his name, Victor Anderson, started, and it really got me interested in basically these modern, these modern like resurgences of witchcraft, and Wicca. So that's why I ended up getting a couple of these books, like the Ronald Hutton book and this book. What's it called? This lady, Susanna Budapest. This one looks good. The My Dark Sordid Past as a Heterosexual. But yeah, I like this one too a lot. I thought she was very honest. There was a lot of ways to connect because a lot of it takes place in California. And she's here in LA, and she's still doing her thing. I think she's on IG as Oracle of Los Angeles. So, and then the last one I just finished reading is called My Experiences Preceding 5,000 Burials by Hamid Bey. And this is a really interesting book. This one came up because I was listening to a lecture by Ray Garcia, who's like a theosophist who does astrology. And he was talking about the ancient Sphinx theory, which actually this book is about, Serpent in the Sky, which basically says that there was a civilization that long preceded ancient Kemet, or ancient Egypt, which kind of makes sense. If that Sphinx was built in the astrological age of Leo, it would make sense. And he alludes to that in this book, saying that the masters who taught him in Egypt were connected to this much, much older tradition. And so basically this guy, he came to the United States also like in the 30s, and he was basically accepted Harry Houdini's challenge to Houdini said he was going to debunk people that were claiming that their feats were like spiritual, because he supposedly, allegedly, was able to pierce himself and not bleed, or bleed at will. He had full control over his his circulation system, was able to go into a trance and be buried underground in a coffin for several hours at a time, maybe even longer, and then was exhumed and came back out of his trance, and then he ended up founding this Coptic Fellowship of America, something like that, which is not part of the Coptic Orthodox Church, but maybe is some kind of connected to it. Turns out the guy was Italian, or maybe in his book he says he was born and raised in Egypt, and he went to Italy, but like his naturalization certificate and stuff like that, he has an Italian name, so maybe he was a charlatan, but seems like the things that he was doing was real. And according to some of the the documentation, he was friends with Parahamsa Yogananda, the guy that wrote the autobiography of a yogi. And he was in LA too. He started his Coptic Fellowship in 1937 in LA, where like Manly Hall started the Philosophical Research Society in 1934. And that yogi was here in LA too. So there's a lot of spiritual stuff going on, especially like alternative spirituality, esotericism, stuff like that going on in the 30s. And it continues all the way up until now. But an interesting time, and I'm kind of trying to see what the milieu was in LA and Southern California at that time, and how it relates to my family and how that ended up shaping them and ultimately me. So that's my religion and spirituality section.